Empires don't collapse in a single moment. They unravel through forgotten emotions and silent wounds. Join Miss Marple as she reveals how the Mughal Empire truly lived, and how it finally let go. Welcome to the series of Driftaway Tales. In this series, we will present historical fictional tales. If you are interested in these, then please subscribe this channel. Chapter 1: The Call of a Forgotten Empire. Fateful Sikri had been abandoned for centuries. Yet on that warm afternoon, the silence felt strangely alert, almost as if the city had paused its breath the moment Miss Marple stepped into the red sandstone courtyard. She had come seeking quiet reflection. India's history fascinated her, and Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar's dream city, seemed the perfect place to sit with her thoughts. But as she walked through the long corridor lined with carved pillars, something unexpected happened. A faint tremor of sound drifted through the passage. Not wind, not echo, something closer to a sigh-soft, trembling human. Miss Marple's heart tightened. She had learned long ago that the world often speaks in ways most people ignore, a floorboard shifting, a curtain trembling, a voice carried by memory rather than breath, and this sound felt exactly like that. She stood still. The whisper came again, barely a murmur. Seek the beginning before it disappears. A strange heaviness settled in her chest. Not fear, she rarely felt that, but a deep, emotional pull. Something in the city was hurting, something forgotten, something that wanted to be understood before it faded from history forever. She took a slow breath. Something was calling her, and she had never been able to walk away from a call for truth. As she stepped toward the courtyard's exit, an elderly man emerged from behind a pillar. His shoulders were slightly bent, but his eyes were sharp, filled with the weight of years and the urgency of someone who had run out of time. "You heard it," he said quietly, as if stating a fact he already knew. Miss Marple looked at him with calm curiosity. "Heard what, exactly?" "The city's cry," he whispered. Only a seeker of truth would hear it. Before she could respond, he held out a cloth-wrapped object with trembling hands. "Take this manuscript," he said. "It holds the first pieces of a story the world has forgotten. I can no longer protect it." Miss Marple hesitated, sensing the intensity of his emotion. He looked terrified, not of her, but of losing something precious. "What story?" she asked gently. "The real beginning of the Mughal Empire," he said. "Not the version written in our books. The version someone tried to erase." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment Miss Marple saw the sorrow of a man who had carried a truth alone for far too long. She accepted the manuscript with both hands. "I will take care of it." His shoulders relaxed as if a burden had finally been lifted. Then he simply nodded, turned, and disappeared into the afternoon light, leaving behind the haunting stillness of a city that had just entrusted her with its secret. Miss Marple pressed the manuscript to her chest. Whatever lay inside these pages, it mattered deeply to someone, and that was enough for her. She found a shaded spot overlooking the ancient water reservoir and slowly unwrapped the manuscript. The pages inside were brittle, yellowed, and tied with faded blue thread, yet they carried a strange warmth, almost like a heartbeat preserved in paper. Carefully, she began to read. The first page contained a single line in elegant Persian calligraphy. "To know how an empire ends, one must understand how it truly began." Her breath caught at the weight of that sentence. It hinted at something deeper than battle records and royal chronicles, something emotional, human, unfiltered. She turned the page. What she saw next unsettled her. Sketches of Babur, First Mughal Emperor drawn with surprising tenderness. Notes describing not only his ambition, but his loneliness, his longing for belonging, his struggle between desire and duty. These were details only someone close to him could have known. But some pages were missing, ripped out, not by accident, removed deliberately. She traced the torn edges with her fingertips, feeling a sting of sadness. Someone had wanted this story altered. Someone had feared what these missing pages revealed. A quiet ache spread in her chest, grief not for a person, but for a truth damaged by time. Miss Marple whispered to the silent city, "I will not let your story be forgotten." And for a moment the warm breeze felt like an answer. She slipped the manuscript safely into her bag and began exploring again, following her intuition more than any plan. Every corner of Sikri seemed to hum with a strange tension, as if the walls were holding memories just below the surface. In a narrow passage near the royal baths, she noticed something odd: fresh footprints in the dust. They were neither from her nor from tourists, and they led toward a restricted section of the palace. Miss Marple followed them slowly, her heart beat steady but alert. Inside the chamber, sunlight filtered through a lattice window, scattering patterned shadows across the floor. And in the center half, buried under dust, lay a small metallic object. She knelt and gently lifted it. It was a broken seal. On its surface was carved the Timurid falcon, the symbol Babur cherished. But beneath it, another emblem had been violently scratched away. Someone had hidden a previous identity. Someone had changed the symbol of origin. Her fingers trembled slightly. This was not simply a historical mystery. This was evidence of someone trying to rewrite the empire's beginnings. A swell of emotion rose in her chest, sorrow for how history had been wounded, and determination to heal it. She placed the broken seal beside the manuscript in her bag. Someone did not want the truth known, but Miss Marple had never been deterred by that. As evening settled over Futefa Sikri, Miss Marple stood on a terrace, watching the sky turn from gold to rose, then to a deep, quiet blue. The city below her looked peaceful, but beneath that peace lived centuries of longing, hope, betrayal, and forgotten truth. She opened the manuscript one more time. The line on the first page glowed in the soft light. "The beginning hides the end." Her heart softened. She felt an unexpected emotional pull, like a gentle insistence from history itself. "I will uncover it," she whispered. Not because she was curious, not because she was restless, but because something inside her understood the pain of being misunderstood, altered, or forgotten. If an empire needed someone to speak for it, she would not turn away. She closed the manuscript gently. Tomorrow she would begin with Babur, and the forgotten truth of the Mughal Empire would finally start to breathe again. Chapter 2: Babur, the restless heart of a founder. The next morning, Miss Marple stood at the edge of the ancient stone terrace, the manuscript resting gently in her hands. The sun had barely risen, yet Futefa Sikri already seemed awake in a quiet, expectant way, like a host preparing to share a long-kept secret. She opened the manuscript to the first section on Babur. Her eyes softened. Babur's story began not with victory, but with longing. A young prince exiled from his ancestral homeland, carrying more hope than certainty. The manuscript described him as a boy watching the mountains of Fergana, dreaming of a future he did not yet understand. Something in those lines stirred Miss Marple deeply. She had always believed that the truth behind great events often lived in the emotions of the people who shaped them. Babur's early writings, translated in the manuscript, revealed loneliness, pressure, fear, and an unshakable desire to build something meaningful. She whispered, almost to herself, Before an empire, there was simply a young man trying to belong somewhere. It felt human, and because it felt human, it felt true. She continued reading. The manuscript described his first attempts to hold Fergana, the betrayals he faced, the nights spent in hiding, the days spent gathering loyal companions. The emotional tone was raw, not glorified, not polished. It showed Babur as a man fighting with himself as much as with enemies. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, imagining him standing before the cold mountains at dusk, wondering where his path would lead. Babur's story was not about power, it was about purpose, and this she realized was the true beginning of the Mughal Empire. She turned the page carefully. The next section should have continued Babur's journey toward Kabul and eventually toward India, but instead, the page was missing, ripped out. Miss Marple felt that familiar tightening in her chest, the same one she had felt when she first held the broken seal in chapter 1. Someone had deliberately removed this page long ago. She examined the torn remains closely. The edges were uneven, suggesting haste. But a faint mark remained, a fragment of ink, barely visible. She brought it closer to the light. The fragment formed the beginning of a word. Not a full word, but just enough to stir her curiosity. Summoned, summit, summer. Babur frequently wrote about longing for the summer breeze of his homeland, but the shape of the letters, it felt like something else. Miss Marple sensed something important had been erased here, not a detail, but a motive. Why did Babur truly come to Hindustan? The history books said ambition. But ambition alone rarely moves a person across mountains and deserts into an unknown world. Something deeper had called him, and whoever tore the page knew that truth mattered. A quiet emotion spread through Miss Marple's sadness for how history often hides its most delicate truths. She breathed softly, steadying herself, and turned to the next available page. What remained of Babur's story was enough to continue, but the missing page would remain in her mind like a door left half open. One day, she hoped, she would find what had been removed. The manuscript shifted tone as Babur approached the plains of Hindustan. Suddenly, the writing became more detailed descriptions of the harsh march, the dust-covered soldiers, the uncertainty of conquering a land so different from the ones he knew. Yet woven through the words was something unexpected, wonder. Babur marveled at the large rivers, fertile lands, and fragrance of unfamiliar flowers. He noted the warmth of the spring air, the richness of the soil, and even the way sunlight touched the fields. This detail moved Miss Marple deeply. People often imagine conquerors as emotionless beings, but here was a man trying to understand a land before claiming it, a man whose heart remained open even while holding a sword. The emotional honesty in these passages felt genuine. She read slowly, letting each sentence settle. Then she reached a section describing the Battle of Panipat, but it wasn't written like a triumph. It was written like a burden, something Babur carried in his chest for the rest of his life. Greater than, victory does not bring peace, the manuscript quoted him. It brings responsibility. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the page. Babur had not built an empire out of pride. He built it because he believed he must. The manuscript ended the Babur section with a reflection that made her pause. He entered India as a wanderer. He became emperor only when he realized India could become home. Miss Marple felt a wave of warmth and sadness mingle inside her. She understood this feeling well. Sometimes, a place becomes home not because we planned it, but because we needed it. Miss Marple sat on a step overlooking the empty courtyard, allowing the manuscript to rest gently on her lap. The morning light had brightened into soft gold, warming the stones beneath her. She felt something personal stirring inside her. For the first time, Babur felt less like a historical figure and more like a person, a man who struggled, hoped, regretted, and loved. A man not so different from anyone seeking meaning in their life. Miss Marple had solved countless mysteries, but they often revolved around individual hearts. This one was larger, an entire empire's heart, but at the center still lay human emotion. She thought of the lonely whisper she had heard the day before. She thought of the broken seal. She thought of the torn page. An emotional pattern was forming. Someone, long ago, had wanted the world to understand Babur. Someone else had been desperate to hide part of his truth. And now both silent pleas had reached her. For a moment, she felt humbled, like she had stepped not into a mystery, but into a responsibility. "Thank you," she whispered softly to the manuscript's unknown author, "for trusting me with this." The city around her remained silent, but the silence felt warmer, now less abandoned, more alive. As the sun climbed higher, Miss Marple closed the manuscript carefully. Her mind was calm, yet fulfilled with emotions and questions that blended into a gentle but determined resolve. She understood Babur more fully now, his fears, his longing, his purpose, but a new mystery had emerged from the shadows. What was in the missing page, and why was someone so desperate to remove it? The broken seal in her bag, the historian's trembling voice, the whisper in the corridor. All of it pointed to one truth. The Mughal Empire did not rise simply through battles. It rose through a complicated story of identity, exile, belief, and belonging. And someone, somewhere, had tried to change that story. Miss Marple stood up slowly. Tomorrow, she would begin studying Humayun, the son who almost lost the empire and yet, against all odds, kept its heartbeat alive. She looked across the city one last time before leaving. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt like history waiting patiently for her to continue. Chapter 3: Humayun, the emperor who lost everything. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the quiet steps overlooking the abandoned courtyard. A soft breeze moved across the red sandstone, carrying the faint scent of earth and sunlight. She opened the manuscript to the section on Humayun, the son who inherited a fragile empire and a heavier burden than any young man should face. Humayun's story began with a line that touched her deeply. He wanted to honor his father, not replace him. Miss Marple paused. That simple sentence carried so much human weight, expectation, pressure, love, fear. Humayun had grown up under Babur's determined gaze, learning from him, admiring him, yet perhaps feeling unprepared to follow such a powerful legacy. The manuscript described how Humayun used to sit quietly by Babur's side, listening more than speaking. He had a gentle heart, a reflective nature, and a scholar's curiosity. Qualities beautiful in a human, but dangerous for a king. Miss Marple could almost see him, a young man standing at the edge of a battlefield, not with ambition, but with a fragile hope that he might prove worthy one day. She touched the page softly. Humayun did not fail because he was weak, she murmured. He struggled because he cared. There was something heartbreakingly human in that truth. The manuscript moved into one of the most painful episodes. In Mughal history, the moment Humayun's empire slipped through his fingers, it began slowly. A tense relationship with his brothers, mistrust planted where support should have been. Shah Jahan rising in the east, a strategist with sharper discipline and clearer purpose. Humayun's inner conflict growing as the responsibilities of rule pressed harder on his gentle nature. Miss Marple felt a deep ache as she read the next lines. He fought not just enemies, but his own doubt. That inner struggle resonated with her. Many people, she knew, lost battles long before swords clashed battles inside their own hearts. The manuscript described the devastating losses, the defeat at Chosa, the retreat from Kanahuj, the slow dissolving of loyalty within his ranks. Humayun wasn't cruel, wasn't reckless. He simply did not know how to navigate a world that demanded unending hardness. Miss Marple closed her eyes. Humayun's fall was not dramatic, was sad. A gradual erosion of certainty, a gentle soul pressed into a storm he could not command. Then came the moment she knew must have broken him. Humayun lost his empire. He fled with only a handful of loyal supporters. He crossed deserts, starved, begged for help, and carried his pregnant wife across burning sands when even horses could not survive. Miss Marple felt her throat tighten. This was not the story of a failed emperor. This was the story of a man trying to protect the people he loved while the world collapsed around him. Her heart ached for him because his story was not one of pride, but of survival. The manuscript's tone softened as it shifted to Humayun's exile in Persia. These pages were filled with emotional nuance: pain, gratitude, loneliness, and healing. Miss Marple read slowly. In Persia, Shah Jahan welcomed Humayun and his small band of followers, but the manuscript revealed something more intimate. Humayun cried when he finally slept in a safe room again. Not because he was defeated, but because he had carried fear in his chest for so long that forgetting it even for one night felt overwhelming. Miss Marple pressed the page gently. She understood this emotion deeply, how exhaustion can sometimes turn relief into tears, how the human heart needs safety more than triumph. The Persian court offered Humayun protection, but at a price. He had to accept Persian customs, clothing, and etiquette. To some, this may seem political. To Humayun, the manuscript suggested, it felt like losing a part of himself. Yet he endured it, because he wanted his family to live, because he wanted his son Akbar to grow up in a safer world than he had. Miss Marple's eyes warmed with admiration. Humayun had lost everything except one thing: his belief that the empire could rise again, and that belief was enough to keep him alive. Miss Marple turned the next page, and the tone shifted again, this time toward quiet determination. The manuscript described how Humayun rebuilt himself piece by piece, like a wounded bird learning to fly again. With Persian military support and renewed strategy, he began reclaiming lost territories step by step. The writing here held a different energy, not triumph, not vengeance, but gratitude. Humayun was not returning as a conqueror. He was returning as a man who had known hunger, humility, danger, and tears. Miss Marple felt a warmth spreading inside her chest. The manuscript wrote, "Exile taught him what power never could. It made him wiser. It made him compassionate. It made him understand the fragility of life and the weight of responsibility." When Humayun finally re-entered Delhi, reclaiming the capital, there was no celebration described in these pages, only a quiet sentence. He stepped into his lost palace, not as a king, but as a survivor. Miss Marple closed her eyes, letting that truth settle. Humayun's victory did not erase his suffering, but his suffering had shaped the future of the Mughal Empire, because it created the father who would raise Akbar, one of history's greatest rulers. And without this painful chapter, the Golden Age would not have existed. The sun had begun to set by the time Miss Marple finished reading. The courtyard around her was bathed in soft orange light, shadows stretching long across the ground. She felt emotionally full, as if Humayun's heartbreak, endurance, and quiet strength had settled gently inside her. This chapter of the manuscript, this human story, brought new clarity. Empires do not rise from victories alone. They rise from the hearts of people who refuse to give up. Humayun had been mocked by history as a weak king. But reading this, Miss Marple knew the truth. He was not weak. He was wounded. He kept walking. She closed the manuscript gently, whispering, "Your story deserved to be told with tenderness." The city around her felt warmer than before, as if acknowledging her understanding. Tomorrow, she would begin learning about Akbar, the child who grew up watching exile shape his father, and who would grow into one of the most extraordinary rulers the world has ever known. Miss Marple stood slowly, ready for the next chapter. History was no longer silent, and she was no longer simply reading it. She was feeling it. Chapter 4: Akbar, the visionary born from exile. Miss Marple sat beneath the shade of a carved archway, the manuscript resting softly in her hands. She had reached the part she had been curious about since the beginning, the chapter on Akbar. History painted him as a mighty emperor, a genius of governance and vision, but Miss Marple sensed the manuscript would show something richer, more human. And it did. The first page of Akbar's chapter opened not with triumph, but with a scene from childhood. Akbar learned to walk in the dust of exile. Miss Marple paused, letting the emotion of the sentence settle. Humayun had crossed deserts holding his infant son close, protecting him from hunger, thirst, and enemies who chased them across unforgiving lands. Akbar's earliest memories were not of palaces or royal comfort. They were of tents collapsing in cold winds, of soldiers whispering anxiously at night, of his mother holding him close while fear pressed at the edges of their world. The manuscript described a moment that instantly softened Miss Marple's heart. Baby Akbar once reached out from his small cradle and touched the tears on his exhausted mother's cheek. Too young to speak, yet somehow sensing her pain, he wrapped his little fingers round her hand. She smiled through her tears. It was a simple gesture, but in that gesture lived the foundation of the empathy Akbar would carry all his life. Miss Marple felt her breath deepen. Great rulers were often born from comfort, but Akbar was born from struggle, and that struggle shaped his heart long before it shaped his empire. Miss Marple turned the next page, and the manuscript shifted to Akbar's teenage years. When Humayun regained his throne, Akbar was still a young boy but already carried a quiet maturity beyond his years. The manuscript noted that Akbar never learned to read or write in the conventional way, something that surprised Miss Marple. Yet what he lacked in formal literacy, he made up for in an extraordinary ability to listen, observe, and interpret human emotions. He read people, the manuscript said, the way others read books. Miss Marple smiled gently. That ability, she knew, was far rarer than literacy. The manuscript described how Akbar would sit silently near the court ministers, watching them argue, whisper, strategize. While others saw politics, Akbar saw fear, ambition, greed, love, loyalty. He understood people not through words, but through presence. A passage caught Miss Marple's attention. Akbar believed that the heart speaks before the tongue does. She nodded softly. That belief explained much of his later life, his tolerance, his inclusiveness, his willingness to embrace ideas beyond his own culture or religion. Even as a young emperor, Akbar refused to rule from distance. He walked among his soldiers, spoke to farmers, listened to mothers, questioned traders. He absorbed the world by living in it, not standing above it. Humayun's teachings had shaped him, but exile had carved him more deeply. Through hardship, he had learned the fragility of the human soul. The manuscript's tone deepened as Akbar stepped into adulthood. When Humayun unexpectedly died, the empire once again trembled on unstable ground. Akbar, only 13, was suddenly emperor. Miss Marple felt a slow ache while reading this part. A young boy standing at the center of a vast empire, surrounded by older men who doubted him, threatened him, tried to control him. The manuscript described nights when Akbar wandered alone in the palace courtyard, looking up at the stars, wondering whether he could carry a responsibility his father had regained only with immense suffering. The eastern provinces rebelled. The north was unstable. The empire was fragile. But Akbar carried something rare: silence that could think, eyes that could see through lies, a heart that remembered suffering. Miss Marple imagined him sitting on a terrace similar to the one she occupied near Wind, touching his face, responsibility pressing against his spirit knot, breaking him but shaping him. The manuscript described an intimate moment that revealed his character. After a particularly difficult council meeting, a frightened servant boy accidentally spilled ink near the emperor's robes. Terrified, the boy fell to his knees. Instead of punishing him, Akbar gently lifted his chin and said, "A mistake does not make you small. Fear does." The boy wept in relief. Miss Marple felt tears prick at the corner of her own eyes. This was the heart of an emperor who would build one of the greatest eras in Indian history, not through force, but through understanding. The manuscript now focused on Akbar's transformative years, when he matured from a young ruler into a visionary. Akbar sensed early that an empire held together by fear could never last. He had seen fear during exile, had felt its cruelty, its smallness. He believed an empire should be rooted in something more human. So he began to search quietly, steadily for a way to create unity out of diversity. The manuscript described how he invited scholars, poets, religious leaders, and philosophers of every background to his court. He listened more than he spoke. He questioned not to challenge, but to understand. Miss Marple paused at a line that felt deeply revealing. He did not ask what people believed. He asked why they believed it. That difference changed everything. It made Akbar a king unlike any other. He abolished taxes that targeted the poor. He welcomed Hindu generals into his army. He treated women in the court with honor and gave them voices in matters of state. All of this was grounded in the empathy born from childhood suffering. Miss Marple felt admiration swelling in her chest. Akbar was not perfect. No ruler was, but the manuscript revealed a man who genuinely sought harmony in a world prone to division, a man who wanted to heal what history had broken. Evening light softened the stones around Miss Marple as she closed the manuscript for the day. She felt a rich emotional fullness, like she had walked beside Akbar through his childhood, exile, doubts, and dreams. Babur had built the foundation. Humayun had preserved the flame, but Akbar, he expanded the flame into a sunrise. Miss Marple realized something important. The Mughal Empire's strength had never come from armies alone. It had come from hearts shaped by loss and longing. The missing page about Babur still troubled her. The broken seal still whispered of a deeper mystery. But she now understood why someone had wanted the true origins of the empire preserved emotionally, not politically. These stories weren't just history. They were lessons about resilience, compassion, and human connection. As the last traces of sunset kissed the sandstone walls, Miss Marple whispered, "Akbar, your vision was not built on power. It was built on understanding." Tomorrow, she would step into the next chapter Jahangir's world, a world of art, beauty, and internal struggle. The empire's story was unfolding gently, truthfully, and Miss Marple was ready for what came next. Chapter 5. Jahangir, the emperor torn between beauty and burden. Miss Marple opened the manuscript the next morning with a quiet sense of anticipation. The sunlight filtered softly through the carved yoli window, painting delicate patterned shadows across the floor. She turned the page to the beginning of Jahangir's story. The first line made her pause. He grew up in the shadow of a sun. Akbar's brilliance had shaped the empire. His wisdom, tolerance, and strength were unmatched. And in that brilliance, Jahangir, born as Prince Salimhed, spent his early years trying to understand who he was supposed to be. The manuscript described his childhood vividly, a boy fascinated by beauty, by painting, by the tiny patterns on feathers, by the movements of nature. He had a soft eye and an observant heart. But he also carried silence inside him. Salim loved deeply, the manuscript noted, but he also deeply feared he would never be enough. Miss Marple pressed her fingertips to the page. She understood this kind of emotional conflict, the pressure to live up to someone great, the fear of disappointing them, the longing for identity. Jahangir was not rebellious by nature. He was just searching for a place where his own light could shine. As Miss Marple continued reading, the manuscript shifted to a more intimate tone. Jahangir's youth was filled with tenderness, but also turmoil. He fell in love easily, intensely, sometimes unwisely. His emotions ran deep, more like an artist than an emperor. But the manuscript described something more painful. Jahangir struggled with insecurity. He doubted his strength. He feared he lacked the clarity of his father. He worried he was not a rightful heir to the dream Akbar had built. To numb the weight of these fears, Jahangir began seeking escapes, sometimes through solitude, sometimes through indulgence in wine. The manuscript did not sensationalize this. Instead, it portrayed the emotional truth behind it. He drank not for pleasure, but for silence. Miss Marple's heart softened. Many people, she knew, tried to silence the noise of expectations. Jahangir was no different. His weaknesses did not come from selfishness, but from a heart that felt everything too strongly. Yet the manuscript also showed his strengths. He deeply appreciated justice. He loved nature fiercely. He kept journals filled with observations about flowers, birds, climates, and people. He understood the fragility of life better than anyone before him. He was not Akbar, nor did he need to be, but he had not discovered that truth yet. Miss Marple sensed the emotional tension rising. Jahangir's inner battle would shape not just his life, but the empire's future. The manuscript now entered one of the most painful chapters of the Mughal story, Jahangir's rebellion against Akbar. Miss Marple read slowly, feeling the heaviness in every sentence. Jahangir had not rebelled out of hunger for power. He rebelled out of emotional confusion, frustration, and the feeling that he would always remain just Akbar's son, never Jahangir, the man. The manuscript described a moment that broke her heart. Akbar looked at his son, not with anger, but with sadness, and Salim looked back with the eyes of a child who still hoped for guidance. Father and son stood divided not by hatred, but by misunderstanding. Jahangir wanted acknowledgement. Akbar wanted stability. Neither knew how to bridge the space between them. The rebellion shook the empire, but the manuscript made clear that the true conflict was not political, it was emotional. Akbar watched his beloved son drift away, and Jahangir felt suffocated by the weight of expectations he could never meet. Miss Marple took a deep breath. This was the first true crack in the Mughal foundation, not because of a war, but because of a wounded relationship. The manuscript ended this section on a note of reconciliation. Akbar eventually forgave Jahangir, bringing him back into the fold. But emotional wounds, Miss Marple knew, rarely disappeared completely. They linger, they shape futures. The manuscript turned warmer as it described Jahangir's early reign. Despite his struggles, Jahangir became a thoughtful emperor. His court glowed with creativity. Painters flourished under him. Naturalists found a patron who appreciated every detail. Poets and scholars admired his sensitivity. Miss Marple smiled gently. For all his flaws, Jahangir ruled with a unique grace. He authored memoirs that revealed an introspective, reflective soul. Someone who found God in the beauty of a leaf and justice in the protection of ordinary people. A passage from his writing was quoted in the manuscript. "I saw a bird this morning, its feathers like powdered silver. In its smallness, I saw the universe." Miss Marple paused at this. Few rulers noticed birds. Fewer still drew meaning from them. He was a man of feeling, a man of observation qualities that made him beloved by many, though misunderstood by others. But even amid his beauty and justice, the manuscript hinted at a deeper, quieter truth. He was always followed by shadows of doubt, of temptation, of longing for what he could never fully grasp. These emotional shadows would shape the coming chapters. For now, though Miss Marple allowed herself to appreciate Jahangir's gentle brilliance, the light around her softened as Miss Marple closed the manuscript for the evening. She sat quietly, letting Jahangir's humanity settle in her heart. Babur had been a wanderer seeking belonging. Humayun had been a survivor shaped by loss. Akbar had been a visionary searching for unity. But Jahangir, he was something entirely different. He was the first emperor whose inner conflict began to seep into the empire itself. Miss Marple understood this with a sinking tenderness. The empire was not declining, yet not visibly. But emotional instability at the top always finds its way into the structure beneath. Jahangir's softness was beautiful, but his uncertainty created small fractures that future forces would widen. She closed her eyes. Jahangir was an artist, she whispered, but the empire needed a fortress. As evening shadows stretched across Fetifer Sikri, Miss Marple felt a growing weight. She sensed that the next chapters, Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, reveal how beauty and power might grow, then break. The story was deepening, and she was ready to walk further. Tomorrow, she would open the section on Shah Jahan, man who built wonders out of love but ruled under the shadow of loss. Chapter 6. Shah Jahan, Love, Splendor, and the Weight of an Empire. Miss Marple settled into the quiet corner of the ruined palace, where the morning sunlight washed over the red sandstone in warm gold. She opened the manuscript to the section on Shah Jahan, prepared for grandeur, but not for what met her eyes. The chapter began with a simple, poignant line. He ruled with his heart long before he ruled with his crown. Miss Marple read slowly. Prince Khurramlata, known as Shah Jahan, had grown up in a court shaped by beauty and conflict. From his grandfather Akbar, he inherited curiosity and tolerance. From his father Jahangir, he inherited sensitivity and a deep appreciation for art. But what truly shaped him was something more intimate: love, real, enduring, overwhelming love. The manuscript described his bond with Arjamand Banu Begum Mumtaz Mahal. Their story was not written like a fairy tale. It was written like something deeply human, to people who understood each other's hearts without effort, who brought calm to each other's storms. Miss Marple smiled gently at a passage describing their early days. When she spoke, he listened with his whole being. When he faltered, she steadied him. This was not the love of legends. This was the love of two souls who fit together quietly and completely. As Miss Marple continued reading, the manuscript shifted to Shah Jahan's accession to the throne. His reign began with dazzling promise. He adored symmetry, elegance, intricate detail, the heart of Mughal architecture. He dreamed of building a world where beauty was not a luxury, but a language. But beneath the splendor, the manuscript revealed something more fragile. Shah Jahan carried immense pressure to honor Akbar's vast legacy, pressure to correct what Jahangir's instability had weakened, pressure to hold an empire that was growing heavier with each generation, the manuscript noted. He built perfection because he feared imperfection within himself. Miss Marple felt a quiet ache as she read that line. She understood the emotional truth behind it. Shah Jahan's extraordinary buildings, palaces, gardens, forts were not simply expressions of taste. They were shields. Shields against insecurity. Shields against political tremors. Shields against the quiet whisper of doubt that every ruler carried. But despite his internal struggles, his reign brought a sense of order and refinement. The empire sparkled under him, its peaks of beauty reaching heights no Mughal had yet achieved. Yet the manuscript hinted at a growing tension beneath the marble and gold. Perfection always demanded a price. Miss Marple turned to the next section with a softened heart. She knew this part of the story, everyone did. But the manuscript shared it not as a legend, but as an ache. Shah Jahan's love for Mumtaz Mahal was the emotional center of his life. She was not merely his wife. She was his confidant, his anchor, the quiet voice that helped him see the world clearly. But during the birth of their 14th child, tragedy struck. The manuscript described the moment gently, respectfully. She whispered his name, and he answered not as an emperor, but as a man losing half of himself. Miss Marple paused, her eyes warming. Shah Jahan mourned with a depth that frightened his court. He withdrew from public life. He barely ate. His hair turned white within months. The manuscript captured the emotional devastation. For the first time, the emperor who built perfection could not hold together the pieces of his heart. To cope with that unbearable grief, he turned to the one language he understood best: creation. The Taj Mahal was not a symbol of pride, was a conversation with sorrow, an attempt to preserve the voice he had lost. The manuscript described his intent. If he could not keep her beside him, he would keep her in a world that reflected her grace. Miss Marple felt her breath tremble. The Taj Mahal was not built for glory. It was built so a broken man could continue living. Miss Marple read on, sensing the chapter shifting again. While Shah Jahan created wonders for the world, the empire beneath him began to strain. The manuscript explained this gently, not critically. Shah Jahan's focus on aesthetic perfection required massive resources. Wars against rebellious regions drained the treasury further. Architectural brilliance came with economic weight. Yet the deeper issue was emotional. In his grief, Shah Jahan softened in some places and hardened in others. He demanded precision, control, order perhaps, to compensate for the chaos he felt inside. His children felt the effects most deeply. Aurangzeb, Shaiko, Shah Shuja, Murad. They grew up not only in a palace, but in a silent competition for his approval. Miss Marple felt the tension as she read. An empire held together by beauty was beginning to tremble under the weight of its own perfection. Shah Jahan was not failing, but he was tired, worn by grief, overwhelmed by pressure. And in that emotional turbulence, the seeds of future conflict began to stir. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. She understood the truth of human history. Sometimes the most beautiful eras set the stage for the most painful ones. The light around her softened into evening as Miss Marple closed the manuscript. The red walls of Fettifor Sikri glowed with a warm, fading radiance echoing the empire she was reading about. Shah Jahan's reign had been magnificent, full of beauty, art, love, grace, but beneath the marble lay exhaustion, grief, and a quiet unraveling. Miss Marple felt a heaviness settle in her heart. The Mughal Empire had reached its aesthetic peak, but at the same time, it was slipping emotionally, structurally, financially. The story ahead Aurangzeb's rise would not be one of splendor, but of intensity and conflict. Yet she understood something clearly now. Every fall begins long before the moment of collapse, and the manuscript was guiding her to see not just the events, but the emotional corridors behind them. She whispered softly, "Shah Jahan built beauty, but he also built the shadows that would one day swallow it." Tomorrow, she would open the section on Aurangzeb, emperor of discipline, austerity, and unyielding power, the turning point of the empire's fate. Miss Marple stood slowly, her heart prepared for the next chapter of truth. Chapter 7, Aurangzeb, Duty, Discipline, and the Beginning of Decline. Miss Marple opened the manuscript early the next morning. A faint chill lingered in the air, as if Fatifa Sikri itself sensed the heavy chapter she was about to read. She turned the page. The chapter on Aurangzeb began with a striking line. He learned strength before he learned tenderness. Miss Marple looked at the words carefully. After reading about Babur's longing, Humayun's sorrow, Akbar's vision, Jahangir's sensitivity, and Shah Jahan's grief, this new tone felt different, sharper, colder, shaped by necessity rather than emotion. Aurangzeb had grown up during a turbulent time, a father drowning in sorrow after Mumtaz's death, brothers competing intensely for future power, an empire struggling under the weight of its own splendor. Where others sought harmony or beauty, Aurangzeb sought stability because he saw instability everywhere. The manuscript described him as a quiet child, observant, withdrawn, deeply devoted, easily wounded, and burdened by a seriousness far beyond his years. Miss Marple felt a soft ache reading this. Children who grow up in emotional storms often build walls around their hearts, not out of cruelty, but out of survival. Aurangzeb's discipline, she realized, was not born from pride. It was born from fear, fear of chaos, fear of weakness, fear of loss, fear that the world his forefathers built was slipping away. The manuscript moved into the darkest period of Mughal family history, the War of Succession. Miss Marple read slowly, feeling the weight of each word. Dara Shikoh, the eldest brother, carried the gentle, philosophical spirit of Akbar. Aurangzeb carried the hard, disciplined fire of survival. Two men shaped by two different understandings of what the empire needed. For Shah Jahan, still drowning in grief, Dara was the light he hoped would lead the empire gently. But the manuscript revealed a painful, emotional truth. Aurangzeb felt unseen, not unloved, but unseen. Miss Marple understood how powerful and dangerous that feeling could be. A child who grows up unseen often learns to seek recognition through achievement or through force. As Shah Jahan weakened, the brothers fought openly. But the manuscript did not portray Aurangzeb as cruel. It portrayed him as determined, terrified that the empire would collapse if left in the wrong hands. A pivotal line captured his mindset. He chose duty over affection, because affection had disappointed him too often. When Aurangzeb defeated Dara Shikoh, the empire changed forever. Not because one was good and one was bad, but because two visions of the world collided, and the harder vision won. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, letting the emotional truth settle. The Mughal Empire's decline did not begin with violence. It began with heartbreak. Miss Marple continued reading, now entering Aurangzeb's reign. He was disciplined in every aspect of life, sleeping little, working endlessly, choosing austerity over luxury, rejecting the pleasures of court life. The manuscript described his daily routine with reverent detail. But what struck Miss Marple most was this: he trusted no one, not even himself. Aurangzeb ruled like a soldier on the front line. He feared indulgence because he saw what indulgence had done to others. He feared weakness because he saw how weakness had shaken the empire. He feared softness because he believed softness had destroyed unity. He built laws with precision. He expanded the empire further than any Mughal before him. He commanded armies with unwavering control. Yet the manuscript added quietly, he expanded borders. But his own heart remained a narrow corridor. Miss Marple felt a gentle sadness. Aurangzeb's strength came from his discipline, but so did his loneliness. He had no time for art, for music, for emotional expression. The warmth of earlier generations faded from his court. He believed he was saving the empire from collapse, but in doing so, he cut away many of the threads that once held it together. The manuscript now shifted into the empire-wide consequences of Aurangzeb's rule. His campaigns in the Deccan were long, exhausting, and costly. The treasury began to thin. The soldiers grew weary. The nobles grew restless. Yet Aurangzeb pressed forward. He believed stopping would invite collapse. But the manuscript describes something deeper. He won territories, but lost trust. Hindu rulers felt alienated by his stricter policies. Sufi circles felt marginalized by his rigid interpretations. Artists felt abandoned. Merchants feared instability. Miss Marple read a line that pierced through her. He was a king, loved for his strength, but not for his presence. Aurangzeb had closed himself off, emotionally perhaps to protect himself, perhaps to protect the empire, but in doing so, he created distance where connection was needed. The empire had grown vast, but fragile, beautiful, but strained, disciplined, but divided. Miss Marple felt the gravity of this moment in history. Aurangzeb was not the villain of the story. He was the turning point, the man who held the empire together with force, even as its emotional foundation slowly cracked. As Miss Marple closed the manuscript at sunset, she felt a quiet heaviness settle around her. The golden light wrapped around the abandoned palace like a fading memory of grandeur. Aurangzeb had been many things: a disciplined son, a determined prince, a powerful emperor, a lonely man. But above all, he had been afraid that the empire built by his ancestors would crumble if he didn't hold it tightly. Miss Marple understood something essential now. The decline of the Mughal Empire did not begin with Aurangzeb's mistakes. It began with the emotional wounds carried forward from generation to generation. Loss, expectation, fear, pressure, misunderstanding. Each emperor inherited more than a throne. He inherited the unspoken pain of the one before him. Aurangzeb's reign was the final tightening of a thread that had been fraying since Jahangir's uncertainty and Shah Jahan's grief. She whispered softly into the evening air. Empires fall the way hearts fall, not suddenly, but slowly, through unattended cracks. Tomorrow she would turn the page to the aftermath, the fragmentation of the empire, the rise of regional powers, and the entry of new players who saw opportunity in Mughal weakness. Miss Marple stood quietly, preparing her heart. The next chapter would not be about rulers. It would be about unraveling. Chapter 8. The Empire Fragments. Voices rising from the edges. Miss Marple opened the manuscript as the morning sun settled gently over Fatefur Sikri. The soft golden light made the abandoned city feel almost alive, like it held echoes of a time that was slipping away. She turned to the next chapter. It began with a quiet, haunting sentence. When the hand that held the empire tight finally loosened, everything began to fall away. Aurangzeb's death left a vast, weary empire behind. Miss Marple felt her heart tighten as she read. The treasury was strained. The army was exhausted. The nobility was divided. The people were restless. And above all, there was no strong emotional bond holding the empire together. For nearly 50 years, Aurangzeb's iron will had forced unity upon the Mughal state. But unity created by pressure dissolves quickly. The manuscript described this moment not as a collapse, but as a slow exhale, as if the empire itself had been holding its breath for too long. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. She knew this pattern well. When a structure depends on one person's strength, it forgets how to stand on its own. When that person leaves, the structure trembles. The manuscript shifted its focus to the Deccan, where the Marathas rose with a spirit of resilience and fierce independence. Miss Marple read the lines with growing admiration. The Marathas were not just warriors, they were people shaped by hardship, land, and a deep belief in their right to govern themselves. Under leaders like Shivaji earlier and later the Peshwas, they had built a strong identity. But after Aurangzeb's death, something changed. Their resistance became momentum. Their momentum became expansion. The manuscript captured the emotion behind their rise. They were tired of being controlled. They were tired of imperial interference. They wanted dignity, autonomy, and recognition. And in the vacuum left by a weakened Mughal center, they found opportunity. Miss Marple imagined the dust roads of the Deccan villages, hills, forts, people carrying the weight of long struggles. She felt the determination in their story. This wasn't simply a rebellion, it was a reclaiming. The Marathas pushed northward, challenging Mughal authority, capturing territories, and negotiating from a position of strength. Miss Marple understood the emotional truth behind this shift. When a central power loses its emotional connection to its people, new powers rise to fill the space. She turned the page, knowing the story was only just beginning. The manuscript now moved to the northwest, where the Sikhs were rising with unwavering courage. Miss Marple felt the change in tone immediately, firmer, prouder. The Sikh community, shaped by the teachings of the gurus and hardened by persecution under certain Mughal officials, had developed a powerful warrior tradition. After Guru Gobind Singh, the Khalsa carried a new sense of collective strength. This rise was emotional as much as it was political. They fought not for territory, but for dignity. Miss Marple admired the clarity of their purpose. The manuscript described how their growing strength made it increasingly difficult for the weakened Mughal administrations in Punjab to maintain control. Then, the manuscript shifted to the Rajputs, whose history with the Mughals had long been complex. They had once tied themselves closely to Akbar's vision. They had fought alongside Mughal armies. They had shared culture, alliances, and honor. But after Aurangzeb's stricter policies strained those ties, their loyalty weakened. The manuscript wrote, "Respect is the bond that keeps warriors united. When respect weakens, unity falls." The emotional truth was clear. The relationship between the Mughals and the Rajputs was never merely political. It was rooted in mutual dignity. Once that dignity faded, the alliance unraveled. Miss Marple exhaled softly. The empire was breaking apart not because its enemies grew stronger, but because its relationships grew weaker. The manuscript now described the internal disarray within the Mughal court scene Miss Marple found deeply painful. After Aurangzeb, a rapid succession of emperors took the throne. Some ruled only months, some ruled through fear, Some ruled through desperation, none ruled through emotional authority. Miss Marple felt a sadness settling over her as she read. A crown that once felt heavy with responsibility now felt weightless, passing from hand to trembling hand. There were palace conspiracies, greedy nobles, short-lived rulers, power struggles that weakened the empire's core. A single heartbreaking sentence summed it up. There were emperors, but no leadership. Miss Marple understood immediately. This was the emotional collapse that followed the political one. When leadership loses its moral and emotional integrity, people stop believing. When people stop believing, even the strongest throne becomes fragile. Miss Marple placed her hand gently on the manuscript. This wasn't just a story of history. This was a story of the human condition. Miss Marple closed the manuscript slowly as the evening sun dipped beyond the red sandstone walls of Fate-Sikriye. Soft wind rustled across the courtyard, carrying the quiet sorrow of centuries. She felt a profound sadness, not for the emperors alone, but for the people who lived through this fragmentation. Farmers tired of changing rulers, merchants uncertain about tomorrow, soldiers fighting with no clear purpose, communities searching for protection and stability. The manuscript ended this chapter with a deeply emotional reflection. Empires do not fall in a moment. They fall when their people stop seeing themselves in the empire's heart. Miss Marple whispered the line aloud, letting its truth settle into her chest. She now understood. The Mughal Empire had not been destroyed by a single war, a single rival, or a single mistake. It had been slowly unraveled by emotional distance, neglected relationships, and leaders who could not carry the emotional weight their ancestors once bore. The manuscript hinted at the next stage, the arrival of a new force, not with swords at first, but with trade, agreements, and subtle influence. The British East India Company. Miss Marple stood quietly, ready for the next chapter. The empire was no longer just breaking. It was being watched by new eyes. Chapter 9. The Shadow of the British East India Company. Miss Marple opened the manuscript as the late morning sun filtered through the carved windows of Fate-Sikriye. The air felt different today, still warm, but carrying a strange heaviness. She sensed this chapter would not be about emperors or grand visions, but something subtler, quieter, and far more unsettling. She turned the page. The chapter began with a soft, chilling line. Empires fall not only to enemies who strike loudly, but to strangers who arrive softly. Miss Marple felt her chest tighten. After Aurangzeb's death and the fractures that followed, the Mughal Empire had grown vulnerable. Internal divisions had weakened it emotionally and politically. People sought stability, leaders sought allies, and hearts longed for certainty. Into this atmosphere stepped a new force, the British East India Company. The manuscript described their arrival not as a threat, but as a polite visitor. Traders, merchants, observers, they bowed respectfully in Mughal courts, presented gifts, and spoke humble words. They made no claims of conquest, only partnership, trade, and mutual benefit. Miss Marple felt a soft chill. Sometimes danger hides behind courtesy. The manuscript noted, they came with ships of goods, but carried ambitions deeper than the oceans. The empire did not see them as a threat, and that was the beginning. As Miss Marple read further, the manuscript explained how the company embedded itself slowly into the fabric of the subcontinent. At first, they requested only trading rights, then warehouses, then small forts for protection, then agreements with Mughal officials, many of whom were desperate for money or power. The manuscript captured the emotional truth behind this shift. Where unity weakens, outside influence finds doors to enter. Miss Marple imagined merchants, soldiers, clerks' company, men moving quietly through busy ports, observing everything with calculating eyes. They learned the land, they learned the people, they learned the wounds of the empire, wounds created over generations. And they used that knowledge not with force, but with strategy. The manuscript described how company officials studied Mughal patterns, which governors were underpaid and unhappy, which regional powers felt ignored, which nobles were ambitious, which rulers were young or weak. Miss Marple felt a deep sadness. This wasn't war, it was observation, patience, and opportunity. The company exploited what the empire had neglected: a longing for stability, a hunger for recognition, a gap in leadership. Trade began transforming into dependency. And dependency, Miss Marple realized, was the first quiet step toward control. Miss Marple turned the page and felt the weight of the next section. The manuscript focused on Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions of the empire. Rich in textiles, agriculture, and culture, Bengal had long been the jewel of Mughal administration. But weakness in the center allowed ambitious regional rulers and company officials to step into a dangerous dance. The manuscript wrote, Bengal became the ground where trust broke. The company used alliances, bribes, and manipulations to support those who sided with them. Miss Marple read with tightening breath. Promises were made behind closed doors. Wealth flowed into company pockets. Suspicion grew among local rulers. The balance of power shifted without a single official declaration. Then came the decisive turning point. The Battle of Plassey, 1757. The manuscript did not describe it as a military triumph. Instead, it captured the emotional betrayal. It was not a battle of swords. It was a battle of broken loyalties. Some of Bengal's own leaders sided with the company, not out of malice, but out of ambition, fear, or promises of reward. Miss Marple felt her heart sink. Empires rarely fall because of enemies alone. They fall when their own people stop believing in them. After Plassey, the company gained control over Bengal's resources. This was not just a regional shift, it was the beginning of a new reality. Trade had become governance. Merchants had become rulers. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, absorbing the gravity of this moment. The manuscript now described how the company expanded its control, not by destroying the Mughal system, but by quietly taking over its functions. Miss Marple felt a shiver as she read. They learned to rule like shadows present everywhere, seen nowhere. The company began minting coins, managing taxes, training local soldiers under their command, influencing court decisions, signing treaties with rulers who needed support. The Mughal emperor still sat on the throne, but his authority was becoming symbolic, a crown with no real power behind it. The manuscript emphasized the emotional dimension. People looked to the company for stability, because they no longer felt the empire's embrace. Miss Marple felt a heavy ache. For centuries, the Mughal Empire had provided unity through its emotional connection with its people, but that connection had faded over generations of insecurity. The company filled the void left behind, not with culture or empathy, but with structure, money, and strategy. And slowly, the empire's heartbeat weakened. As the evening sun softened into deep gold, Miss Marple closed the manuscript gently. The wind brushed past her, carrying a sense of quiet melancholy. She now understood the transition deeply. The Mughal Empire did not fall to invasion. It fell to a shift in trust. People trusted the company to bring stability. Rulers trusted the company to protect their ambition. Merchants trusted the company to enhance trade. And slowly, silently, the empire lost the one thing that had held it together for so long: emotional belonging. The manuscript ended this chapter with a powerful reflection. When the people's hearts move away from an empire, the empire's walls soon follow. Miss Marple held the manuscript close. She sensed the story was nearing its end. The final chapter where the Mughal Empire, after centuries of grandeur, faced the last unraveling. Tomorrow she would read about the final emperor, the fading crown, the empire's quiet goodbye. But for now, she stood in the silent ruins of Fatih Sikri, feeling the shadow of history stretch gently over her. The end was coming, and she was ready to understand it. Chapter 10: The Empire's Last Breath. Miss Marple's Reflection at the Red Fort. Miss Marple opened the manuscript for the final time. A soft wind brushed across the ruins of Fatih Sikri, as if the ancient city knew she had reached the end of the story. The last chapter began with a quiet, sorrowful sentence. A crown outlives its purpose when the heart that holds it no longer believes in its own power. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The manuscript now spoke of Bahadur, Shah Jahan, Muhammad Shah Rangila, and the countless emperors who followed after Aurangzeb, men who carried the imperial title, but not the emotional authority of their ancestors. Miss Marple read slowly. The emperor still sat on the peacock throne. The court still wore silk and jewels. The rituals continued. The ceremonies continued. But something vital was gone. The empire had structure, but no soul. Miss Marple felt a deep ache. These later emperors were not evil, nor incompetent. They were simply born into a world where the throne no longer meant what it once had. Their decisions were shaped by fear, compromise, and the overwhelming shadow of the British East India Company. Even the emperor's own soldiers took orders from company officials. Even the emperor's decrees were filtered through foreign hands. The manuscript noted, they wore the crown, but its weight had grown to light. The Mughal Empire had not collapsed, had faded, and sometimes fading is more painful than falling. Miss Marple turned the page, and her breath tightened. The manuscript now described Nader Shah's invasion in 1739, when the Persian conqueror stormed into Delhi and unleashed devastation the empire had never imagined. The text did not dwell on violence. Instead, it captured the emotional breaking point. Delhi cried that night not for lives lost, but for dignity taken. Miss Marple imagined the Red Fort trembling under the sound of foreign boots. She imagined mothers clutching children, nobles hiding in terror, the emperor powerless to defend his own capital. The manuscript explained that this moment shattered the illusion of Mughal strength. After Nader Shah, even ordinary citizens understood. The empire was no longer a shield, it was a shadow. Years later, Ahmad Shah Abdali invaded repeatedly. Punjab, Kashmir, and Delhi suffered again and again. The manuscript wrote, "A house already cracked cannot withstand storms." Miss Marple felt sorrow rise inside her. The emotional core of the empire, its confidence, its unity, its belief in itself, had dissolved. The invasions were symptoms, not causes. Then came the final humiliation. The emperor asked permission to rule the land his ancestors had built. Miss Marple closed her eyes. The Mughal Empire had lost its voice, and when a nation loses its voice, others begin speaking for it. The manuscript's final historical section centered on Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor. Miss Marple felt emotions swell as she read. Zafar was not a warrior, not a ruler, not a strategist. He was a poet, gentle, reflective, wounded by the world around him. His empire extended barely beyond the walls of the Red Fort. He ruled in name only. The British controlled the army, the treasury, and the courts, and yet, his poetry gave him a dignity that power never could. The manuscript quoted one of his lines, "I asked for a life of meaning. Time gave me only a name without a kingdom." Miss Marple felt tears sting her eyes. Zafar's sorrow was not anger, it was resignation, like a man watching a sunset he cannot stop. The manuscript described his final years. The 1857 uprising erupted. Indian soldiers, nobles, and ordinary people looked to Zafar as a symbol of resistance, not because he held power, but because he represented a lost era of dignity. For a moment, hope flickered, but the rebellion failed, and Zafar, the last emperor of a once mighty empire, was exiled to Rangoon. The manuscript's words trembled with emotion. A man who once held the dreams of millions was buried in a foreign land without a title. Miss Marple pressed the page gently. The Mughal Empire did not end with a shout. It ended with a quiet, sorrowful whisper. Miss Marple reached the final page of the manuscript. There were no more kings, no more battles, no more politics, just a final reflection. Empires rise from hope and fall from forgetting their humanity. She read the paragraph below it. Babur searched for belonging. Humayun searched for survival. Akbar searched for unity. Jahangir searched for peace. Shah Jahan searched for beauty. Aurangzeb searched for control. Their descendants searched for what was already lost, the heart of an empire. Miss Marple felt a powerful wave of understanding. The Mughal Empire had not died from a single cause. It died because it forgot the emotional needs of its people. It forgot to adapt. It forgot to hold on to the compassion that built it. The British did not conquer hearts. They conquered spaces left empty by broken relationships and fading trust. The manuscript's last handwritten line was simple, soft, and devastating. An empire falls when its people no longer see themselves in its story. Miss Marple closed the manuscript with trembling fingers. She felt the truth of every word. That evening, Miss Marple walked through the quiet corridors of the Red Fort. The sun was setting, painting the walls in warm, fading gold. She carried the manuscript close to her heart. She walked past empty chambers where once emperors planned the future, past balconies where musicians played for royal families, past courtyards where soldiers once marched proudly. Now, only silence remained. But in that silence, Miss Marple felt the presence of every soul she had studied. Babur's resilience, Humayun's sorrow, Akbar's vision, Jahangir's beauty, Shah Jahan's grief, Aurangzeb's discipline, Zafar's poetry, all of them were here, not as rulers but as human beings. She reached the marble platform where emperors once addressed the empire. The breeze brushed her face softly, almost like a farewell. Miss Marple whispered into the evening air, "Empires do not vanish. They become lessons for the hearts that remain." She looked at the horizon, glowing with the last light of day. The Mughal Empire had ended long ago, but its humanity, its stories, its emotions still echoed across India. In architecture, culture, memory, and the quiet spaces of history, Miss Marple placed the manuscript gently on the stone ledge. Her investigation was complete, and the empire, finally, had spoken its truth.